we made it. Hey, look at how we made it. Ah, see the way we make it. I had a badass presentation today. Oh my god. It was critical theory presentation. And guess what? I was the first lead speaker, like for the whole semester. It was a daunting and really challenging endeavor, but I killed it because God is here and abundance is here. I'm so exhausted. I just need to take a hot bath, have a good dinner, sleep, and then it's afternoon, right?
Yes.
I'm excited and apprehensive at the same time. Excited because I had an opportunity to really dive deeper into these different big words and to just kind of put all the pieces together. And I'm apprehensive because I happen to be the first person leading this, seminar discussion. So I hope that this conversation enriches us and above all, we're able to see through see meaning in the seemingly small things and kind of have a different perspective to how symbols, words, you know, images are used to kind of exert control. And unconsciously, we don't even know that we're being controlled. It's just a very fascinating, process. So today, I will be talking. Oh, so I will be looking at the Tyron Matthews, how the nickname came about and how this nickname kind of shaped and reshaped the image of this footballer in American football. And most importantly, how this player had to consciously, unconsciously strive to negotiate economic power, by accepting and disclaiming that identity. And so to kick off, I'll just want to just give a short introduction, then I'll go deep into the content of today's conversation, and then I'll give my conclusion and some reflections. To start with, in the past few weeks, we've looked at critical theory, and then one of the things we learned is that critical theory is a lens for understanding power dynamics in our world and how these dynamics even affect us as individuals. And one of the things we learned is that the goal of critical theory is to draw attention to unsatisfactory events and radically affect needed change. Today, I'll be leading this conversation. Specifically, I'll be talking about how articulation theory is deployed to engineer pop culture. To aid our understanding of this work that I'm doing here, I will give some background as to how articulation theory developed. Also, I'll touch on the sine qua non, or perhaps the prerequisite for articulation, which is ideology and hegemony. Also, I will briefly describe how ideology evolved to include hegemony. Now, I don't know if it is hegemony or hegemony.
Either way.
It doesn't matter, right? So, first of all, what is articulation theory? Articulation, articulation theory, or AT, I might want to use that, permits me, is an interesting concept from what I read. And this idea has remained with us even before we knew it to be articulation theory. So think about this idea, or think about a lady who goes to a shop and says, I want this hairstyle. I want the Anita Baker hairstyle. Now, there is an image that comes to mind when we think about the hairstyle Anita Baker, right? And so, for the person making the hair for this person, you don't really need to ask this person, what do you mean by Anita Baker? Because there is an element which is that person or the personnel Anita Baker, and the Esther, which is now being connected to this individual. And so, you who is going ahead to say, I want this Esther, you don't need to further explain because that image has pervaded the media somehow, and somehow people have come to associate the hairstyle with the person, and it's now, an idea that we feel comfortable with. And so I just wanted to use that very straightforward explanation or, idea to just kind of contextualize what exactly is articulation theory. Um, so, okay. So the idea behind articulation theory is that it works to create images or to create identities or to recreate identities of a person, of a place, or a thing. According to articulation theory is the use of language. Let me define that. And in this case, language can be a symbol, it can be a text, it can be images, and all of these are used to create or recreate meanings over time in order to give a definition or to redefine social concepts. DeLuca, in his description of what articulation theory is, helped us to really focus on the work of Laclau and Mouffe. And, one thing that really stands out in this idea or the definition of what articulation theory is, I'm just going to quote the definition from Laclau and Mouffe, and then I'll go on to explain further. So according to Laclau and Mouffe, articulation theory is defined as the practice of establishing relationships among meanings such that their identities are modified or remodified. In other words, articulation theory is the process through which we use one concept to create or recreate the image of a situation, just like I said, a person, place, or thing. And when you think about this definition, think about the illustration that I gave earlier on about the Anita Baker hairstyle and then the person, and how these two images have come to be represented. Have come to represent one thing, either the hairstyle or the person, depending on the context. And another example that I think is applicable to this conversation is how we associate the doll with a, we associate the doll with a girl child and some other things with a male child. And that now, I would like us to take note that articulation cannot take place, or the creation or recreation of meaning for a thing, a place, or an idea cannot happen without some basic prerequisites. And so, what are those things that help us to create or recreate meaning? These things are, first of all, there must be antagonism. So, what exactly is antagonism? Or perhaps before I go on to talk about antagonism, let me say that the process of creating meaning involves the idea, or no, that process requires speaking forth and linking of elements. So, you cannot, so for instance, an idea that is not, promoted through a particular channel cannot be considered as something that is being articulated. So there must be a channel where that idea is unconsciously or consciously being promoted. I remember growing up in Nigeria, we used to there are different, movies that you watch, and then somehow you begin to connect. So there's this lady in Nigerian movies called Jennifer. It might not make sense to you, but I'm going to come up with an example that resonates with this audience. And so, when I got to secondary school, I began to connect that personality, Jennifer, with, now, what did she represent in the movie? She represented an outspoken young woman who is daring, who is willing to give it all to get, just someone who is just a go getter, right? So you identified with Jennifer at that time when she was being described, or when the image of the go getter image, pervades the media, means that you are saying to everyone around you that you are a go getter. Now, as soon as this image changes, right, you can't possibly attach the go-getter idea to to yourself, or perhaps you still go out there and say, I'm Jennifer. When the images changes, then you automatically, the idea of Jennifer automatically changes for whosoever it is that is listening to the person, or who is seeing or viewing that idea. Or so let me think of another example here. So, we're all students of UA, right? And when I think about how, okay, so for instance, if I take a picture standing in front of Danny Chimes, so that location for anyone who sees that picture on social media, who is someone from this space, the specific audience here, I mean, me, I'll say the University of Alabama students. The assumption is that I'm at the university, right? And so it makes sense to them because that image over there is linked to the idea of being a student. I don't know if this makes sense. Now, for a different audience or people from back home in Nigeria, it won't make sense to them. It might just be, okay, she's taking a random picture. And so there must be a language which can be an image or symbol that helps to facilitate the process of articulation. I hope this makes sense so far. Are we good? So, I said that speaking forth is very important. And what do I mean by speaking forth? The channel through which the idea is expressed or projected. That's basically what speaking forth means. Linking elements simply refers to the process whereby one idea or one entity is connected with another entity to create a meaning per time. I say pattern because that image can evolve over time depending on a number of factors, as we would come to realize, in the story or in the representation of Tyra Matthew as Oni Badger. I would want to skip some parts so that I don't dwell so much on the introduction and miss the real essence of this conversation. So now I'm going to talk about certain point. I'm going to talk about articulation in a different way. And what I'll be saying is, first thing is, when does articulation take place? And at every point, I'll be connecting each point with the Tyron Matthew persona and then how the nickname came about, and just to kind of put those pieces together. So antagonism here refers to this is something this so when does articulation take place? There must be a situation, there must be a state of anarchy, perhaps. And antagonism is that idea which refers to, according to DeLuca, antagonism is a given situation that must be addressed, and articulation becomes the tool for addressing the situation. So if we have a negative perception about people from Africa, or perhaps the idea that Africans are uneducated, there must be a channel, there must be a speaking forth, there must be the linking of an image with Africans before we can say that Africans are actually educated. So every time we think of Chimamanda Adichie, right, we're like, wow, she is African. So that image, Chimamanda, and the possibility of it being linked with, you know, Africans. And for instance, so I'll make this more straightforward. So I am from Nigeria. Chimamanda is Nigerian. So I walk into a room and I say, I'm Nigerian, and then someone says, wow, you must know Chimamanda. So there is this, how did Chimamanda become that personnel, or how do I become associated with, or how did I get to the point of becoming associated with Chimamanda? That is the process of articulation. And that is because the media has given Chimamanda the opportunity to be at places where, places where the smart people have conversations, the I don't want to use the word smart people, perhaps intelligent people or intellectuals have had to gather. So, because of that image that has pervaded Western media about Chimamanda, if someone meets me and I say I'm Nigerian and the person suddenly associates me with Chimamanda, the assumption is I am smart or I'm intelligent, right? And so somehow we can recreate an existing perception of a person or thing or place through the process of articulation. I hope this makes sense. And there must be antagonism, like the idea that Nigerians are impoverished, they are not intelligent, right? That's a situation. And the process through which this image is reshaped, or the image making of Nigerians through media for someone like Chimamanda, who has gotten different opportunities to speak at TEDx, different places, has come to reshape that existing, negative notion about Nigerians. So another point I would like to make is now relating this idea with Tyrann Matthew. I remember Bauer and Anna, talking about Tyrann Matthew, for instance, based on his bad record in LSU. And one thing that stands out for me is the idea that his record in LSU present for us a state of antagonism. I mean, a negative image that is, a negative situation that has to be reshaped or corrected or articulated or rearticulated. I hope this makes sense. And so if I'm on course, please let me know. And so the need to change this, to reshape this image of this individual had to happen before he could become acceptable or accepted into the NFL. So the previous image of Tyrann Matthew is the idea that, now let's think about Tyrann Matthew and the phrase or the moniker Honey Badger. The video is such an interesting one. And of course, for those who have seen the video, just think about how Randa was painting the image of the honey badger and how the honey badger is fierce, ruthless. And these different, synonyms became words that somehow, when the subconscious of people who who saw um, Tyrann Matthew as someone who is ruthless, especially because of his record in LSU. And so the existing situation or that negative situation or that antagonistic kind of context necessitated the repair or the rearticulation of his image. And so how did this happen? And we're going to talk about that. And now, this is one thing that I think is really interesting to notice, that for many African American or players of color, right? There's always this there's always this antagonistic situation that requires for them to reshape or articulate their image in a different way. When I say that, I think about not just Tyrann Matthew, I think about Michael Vick. And, watching some videos, I saw how Michael Vick had to reshape his identity by, by taking part in community service work. And in addition to that, by taking on that role of subjecting or putting himself under someone who, in quotes, is a mentor, a Christian mentor, as it were. And so there is this. So what I see here is how in sports or in the world of pop culture, certain forces, depending on what interest is at stake, become partakers in the process of articulating or rearticulating the image of footballers or players. Now, where does articulation take place? That's the next thing I'd like to talk about. Articulation takes place in the society. There must be a society, a given, setting before articulation can take place. So society is a place where the linking of elements of the creation or recreation of identities take place. Laclau and Mouffe claim that society is never objective. So when society is never objective, this implies that the creation of one meaning can foster the creation of multiple, often unintended meanings. And one example, so this makes me think of how the Honey Badger nickname that was created ended up having several meanings, right? And so it didn't just create several meanings. It led to several controversies for Tyrann, even as an individual. For instance, the first nickname, according to Bauer and Hannah, describes Tyrann's skillfulness and ferocious nature. And then, which of course represents the black male bodies, the typical nature of black men or the colored people, as aggressive and hypermasculine than white bodies. You find this in page 117. Now, how does articulation take place? Remember that I've talked about where does articulation take place. I've talked about where does articulation take place. Now I'm talking about how does articulation take place. What is the process? For articulation to take place, first of all, articulation is fostered through a process, which is how. Now that's what I'm talking about. So at the core of this process is rhetoric. To use rhetoric, rhetoric basically is the idea of persuasion or moving people to take action for peace or for war. Burke in 1993 claims that persuasion takes place with language, and this language is what we create or recreate through articulation. So, how does articulation take place? It takes place through the use of rhetoric. I hope that makes sense. So, rhetorically speaking, the description of tyrant as honey badger is rhetorical. That's the use of language because it is a strategic use of language. And so, rhetoric is not the use of everyday word. It is strategic. It is aimed at promoting an idea. It is aimed at branding or rebranding, or shaping or reshaping. Those are just different words to just help us, understand what exactly or how does articulation take place or the process of articulation. And so the honey badger moniker that was wielded rhetorically aimed to serve an agenda. Every act of rhetoric, according to Bitzer, there must be an exigence, right? So what exactly is exigence? The exigence or the concept exigence is almost similar to antagonism. But exigence here is a situation, my accent is messing up with me. A situation such as a moment, so let me give an example of a situation. The moment when the ESPN podcast, there was a podcast interview where Tyra had to explain how the name came to be. Now, in this case, I would say that um, the exigence is not related to the interview, but of course the idea that he had to explain the coming to be of the name is a process whereby is basically implies that he's trying to help us understand the exigence, the situation, right? And so, what was the situation? I've talked about his journey before he joined his career in LSU, and how there was a negative identity and how he had to reshape this identity and before moving into NFL, especially because of the economic interest of the of of the I don't want to use the word coaches of course people the active players in the NFL. I hope that still helps us to understand what I'm trying to say. So now I'm going to give a couple of examples to help us understand the process of exigence or what exactly exigence is about. So 2012, his dismissal was in 2012, and then the Oni Badger then represent at that time. The idea was that this guy is dangerous, which of course is the nature of black people, and so we see race being negatively represented, and so there was then the need to change this. The situation was black people are dangerous, which of course we see in the nature of Tyrann Matthew. And this was further established because according to the Brower and Hannah article, this young man was accused of taking drugs. And of course, this idea that black people or people of color are being associated with everything negative was an impression that had to shift and was an image that had to be reshaped or rearticulated. And so the situation here is the exigence. And the process, there was then need to change that identity before it becomes accepted into NFL. So another thing I would like to say is when articulation takes place, there must be an audience. So the audience here refers to the not just the viewers or people at home who enjoy football, the active players themselves or the decision makers. So basically, for articulation to take place, there must be an audience, and this audience must act in response or participate in the use of rhetoric in within the context of articulation. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say here is for an idea to become accepted or for the when an idea is created or recreated, it must be accepted by a group of people. And the way through which it becomes acceptable is through language or rhetoric. And for that language or the rhetorical process of of carrying out that articulation cannot exist without a particular group of people who unconsciously would have to take in this idea. So on one hand, we have the audience or people at home who are engaging with sport or who are actively, participating in the process or in the well, not participating, but who of course watch football or American football. And of course, we have on the other side the decision makers who definitely must participate in this process, especially because of the economic interest at stake. So the third thing that happens when articulation takes place is constraints. So what do I mean by constraint? Constraint are the oppositions that a language is faced with. The constraint for the articulation and rearticulation of Tara Matthew as Onimaja present a number are many, if not so many. One is on one hand is the problematic nature of the moniker and how this represents the rootless nature of colored people or African American men, although he is not African American, but because he was born in Louisiana, I mean, he became associated with the black people. Using Randall's words, the honey badgers are crazy, fearless, carefree, and have no regard for any other animal. So the problem or constraints of Tyron's articulation as honey badger suggests that, metaphorically suggests that black uh, is ruthless, is carefree, and of course has cares, ruthless and carefree. Let me relate the description to those two words. Remember that I said I'm talking about constraints. And so there was a different intention when the Honey Badger moniker started pervading media. But the widespread of that idea or that concept generated a lot of controversies. And so those controversies became the constraints or the problems that became associated with the name. So the now one other thing I'd like to say is, the narrator Randall here metaphorically for me represents whites or white supremacy, and the proclamation of Tyrant as Oni Badger then suggests an ideological representation of black race as ruthless, based on some of the point that I already, said. Now, moving on, Slack gives us a different perspective so that we have better understanding of what the not the Badger moniker, right, but the idea behind articulation. And so, according to Slack, of course, Slack referenced a lot of works, but I'm not going to start mentioning those other works that he referenced. I'm just going to take focus on some points that were made by Slack just to kind of help us understand better how articulation theory has been used over time, and specifically narrow it down to how it relates to the Honey Badger moniker and of course the Tyra Matthew persona. So according to Slack, um, there are two words here. There's a concept called economic reductionism and class reductionism. Now, these two words can help us understand why Tyran had to disassociate and then reclaim the name Honey Badger. How did this actually play out? First, we need to understand these two words. What is economic reductionism and what is class reductionism? According to Slack, economic reductionism happens when a society is reduced to a place where economy controls everything. Tyrant owing up to the negative ideology associated with the name before his career in NFL requires that he rebrands to accept white controlled economy. So, in other words, Tyrant would be out of business if of course, uh, he is not able to reshape or recreate a new identity. So, moving on, the ESPN interview signifies the rebranding of Tyrant to become sellable and serve the whims and caprices of the white hegemony. I remember in one of the interviews where he was silent. He didn't agree or disagree with the renaming or with the new identity or with with the moniker Oni Badger. Now, this happened when his career in NFL started. Now, because there was this need for him to still be on the side of the whites, especially those who, of course, are controlling the resources or materials or access to opportunities, disassociated himself at that time when he started his career in NFL was going to mean that he was disassociating himself from everything that the white supremacy represented. Because when his career in NFL started, one of the things that happened was there was a documentary that, ESPN sponsored just to give him the branding or to project him the way they want. And so the name was still with him, or the name was still something he was carrying with him. But at that time, when he had gotten ESPN support, or I mean, NFL, sorry, he needed to take on that identity, whether he wanted it or not. And that was also a way for him to, you know, to negotiate economic power. And so this brings me back to the idea of economic reductionism, which is, of course, everything is being controlled by economy. And so to remain relevant, right, you have to negotiate your power, your position, your prestige through the economy. And of course, by being on the side of the active players, in this case, those who wanted him to retain the name Oni Badger, but of course, after you know, at a different time. So another thing I'd like us to know, okay, let's talk about class reductionism. Class reductionism maintains that everything is determined by class. To challenge to challenge the word honey in the honey badger, in my own understanding, is to antagonize the gay ideology, which is then integrated in class reductionism. And what am I trying to say here? Queerness became associated with prestige. And I think about this, I think about Randall. Randa is not an ordinary person or a pauper, right? And so taking on the Oni, or even though he didn't feel comfortable about it, would mean that he was beginning to enter a particular class or become associated with a particular class or group of people. And so that word, the acceptance of that identity meant in this case that this person then belongs to a particular class. I mean the upper class. Another example that I think is applicable here is I can't remember his last name. I think Samuel, the very first person who officially declared that he is gay.
Uncle Sam.
Sam, right? Michael Sam. Now, I was watching one of the interviews, or the one with Oprah, and how this guy looks all good looking. Like, you would see class. He represents class. I mean, from the way he carries himself, from the way media presented him, right? Or projected him, as it were. We begin to see how queerness or being gay was became uh, well, metaphorically represents being opportune, well positioned, and of course, class. So I have a couple of reflections here, and before that, what actually facilitates articulation was something that I think we all need to think about, and I also thought about it, and these are some of the thoughts that I noted down. So so far we've talked about how does articulation take place, where does it take place, and in what way. Now we want to look at the things that actually facilitate the process of articulation. Here I will talk about ideology and hegemony, or hegemony. So according to Marx, the process, so I'll define, then I'll just go ahead and explain. Marx says that articulation is the process through, sorry, Marx says that ideology, not articulation now, is the process through which the upper class promotes a particular belief, or project a social reality for their economic gains. When I think about this, I think about how post the LSU career, the Honey Badger identity shifted in order to serve the whims and caprices of those in the NFL. And Marx suggests that ideology is an instrument created or wielded by the oppressor to suppress or maintain control over the oppressed. I mean, see the dynamics or the shift in the entire Matthew's identity, or connection with the honey badger, and how first he struggled with being accepted because of the honey badger's initial connotation or description as representing ruthlessness and everything negative about the black race, and how this shifted to representing class, especially for someone who needed to be able to position himself in order to access opportunity and maintain a particular class. And so what I'm saying, what I'm trying to help us understand is Marx tells us that when ideology is promoted, at, of course, ideology is something that has to be promoted through a channel or through a process or through language. And of course, language being rhetoric. And this ideology can change from time to time. Of course, that's something I'm going to talk about very soon. Now, what I've been able to establish here is that based on Marx's understanding or perspective, the upper class or the oppressor uses, you know, promotes certain ideologies or certain, concepts in order to control the weak or the oppressed. And one example that I think is applicable here is how the media was also used to fuel the initial identity or the initial description of Tyra Matthew, and how this honey badger was then associated, how he was associated with the honey badger negatively. That was a way to control him. And if he needed to stay relevant and be accepted within a particular class, of course, especially um, as far as his career is concerned, he had to what? Bend to the whims and caprices, or I mean, subject, I mean, kind of meets, come under the, how do I put this? I hope this makes sense. He had to maybe meet the terms and conditions of the white supremacy, which of course was something he had to do. I am repeating a lot of things because I just have to, go back to some of the point that I've made so that we kind of understand what I'm trying to do here.
If I heard you say, you have a section you want to talk through about the kind of pushback, that the rearticulation part, and the kind of, can we pause
Okay.
and get the group kind of chime in on ways we see it kind of on that ideological controlling side, and then lead us through the resistance side too. Is that okay?
Okay.
I'm watching the time. We got some voices in, but I know you have more to cover. Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, I'm
Yeah,
almost
no.
done, but of course.
Can we do a pause there, because I'm
yeah.
curious if folks will chime in on how they see the controlling piece of it. You gave us all
Mhm.
that nice background.
Okay.
I'm gonna pause your camera for a second.
Sure, that's okay. So I think the need to rearticulate or recreate his image, or what actually necessitated that, was the need to take, to go the redemptive narrative, right? The need for black people or African American footballers to what consciously, one way or the other, change the perception the that the media has of them as either being ruthless or representing everything negative or whatever negative that the black represents, right? And so the rearticulation process was, for him, the need to recreate or reshape his identity, not as someone who is ruthless with ruthless, but of course as someone who, even though he still takes on that tenacious nature, but of course he drops the ruthless, he had to drop the ruthless identity and take on the nature of a determined and perhaps, you know, I'll say the word is determined individual who, of course, needs to gain access to opportunities with a new identity. And of course, that is something that I think many of those many of the footballers had to do from time to time, especially because so there is this conflict in identity. On one hand, the media constantly wants to portray them or represent them as everything negative. When I say that, I think about um, the this other guy, Sherman,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about is Michael, and then there are some other folks, or the Vic. I think
Mm-hmm.
about Vic. I think about him. For what two examples that really, I think I can really connect together are how Vic had to change his identity or rearticulate his identity by coming under a white mentor to reproject or I mean to shift attention from everything that everything negative that the media or the white wants everyone to see the black people as, to represent that group of people as a group that can at least be redeemed. So that brings me back to the concept, the redemptive narrative that many of these footballers had to constantly negotiate. And the need to, to change that identity is because of the need to gain economic access, or to get access to opportunities, or to gain position. And so if there was no, so you see, in between or in the process of rearticulating for Tyrant, it was mainly because he had to renegotiate his entrance into the world of American football. And to do that meant he had to drop an identity, take on another identity, but of course retaining the same name. And that is, of course, because of the economic implication of not doing so. And I also see that, the whites constantly take on this savior nature of trying to redeem the blacks. And this is not something that is only we can only see as we it's not this is not something that we can only think of, or we can think of when we think about Tyron Matthew. This is also an idea that, is represented in different contexts, not just in sport, in media. I think about boxing, I think about the image of Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali, and how he had to also at some point renegotiate his entrance in that space, and how the need to change identity. And okay, so I'm not going to dwell so much on that. There's something I wrote here, which is there is a process. Now, there's something I think actually helps articulation, or that aids the process of articulation or re-articulation in this case, which is what I would, which is some, I think I'll describe that as hegemony or hegemony. So this is an idea that came after Marx, Karl Marx. Karl Marx focused mainly on the fact that the oppressor wants you to, wants to promote a particular belief, and the way they will do that is to force the oppressed to accept that, belief. Forcing can also relate to constraining them within a space, so that one way or the other they take on that identity. And over time, of course, other scholars had other things to say. Specifically, Gramsci came up with the idea that an identity can be recreated. And one of the things that helps in the process of articulating or rearticulating an identity is hegemony or hegemony. And what exactly is hegemony? Here I wrote here that so hegemony is the unconscious propagation of an idea without the use of force and with the use of consent. So for Matthew, I see this is something that actually happened. So to reemphasize the ideology, so what I have here is, it is logical to assume that the association of the nickname Honey Badger with Aramantu was ideological. First, because it was done in an unconscious way using media and sport. Next, they took the hegemonic approach, which is given that the player consented in the articulation and of course, I mean, in the rearticulation of the name, as evident in all many of his interviews when he began to renegotiate or when he began to post his LSU career. And so somehow we see instances or cases where this footballer had to consent to the new identity consciously, unconsciously. Oh, what's your name? Right? Are you Tyrant or are you is it Tyrant Matthew? All of those comments flying around. It makes me think of, you go into a room and then you say, my name is Bisola Miriam. And then someone says, Bisola Miriam? And I'm like, okay, you know what? BM, right? Because you're unconsciously consenting to changing your identity because of the constraints of that conversation. I don't know if that makes sense. And so, the interpretation for me is hegemony is not something that actually is done through force, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. It is done unconsciously, and using the media. Of course, the media is a major platform through which this takes place. I mean, several ideas, several. We think of children and the associate. A child associated himself or herself with a particular cartoon character. These many ideas are unconsciously pushed on our faces without us realizing it. And that brings me back to my very one of my first I mean one point that I made before I started this conversation about how we need to begin to pay attention to the things that don't really make sense but of course have deeper meaning than we can possibly see. I remember back home when my kids watch programs. I remember at the time there was an article that people started sharing about the fact that when kids are watching some of those shows on TV, new I mean there is this recreation of images or recreation of ideas or creation of ideas or ideologies, and the TV or these shows become channels through which these ideas are sold to us in the most unconscious way. And so unconsciously for Tyra Matthew, he had to take on that identity, especially when, are you Tyrant or are you Matthew? Just to at least get past that the controversial pronunciation, as it were. Okay, you know what? Just call me whatever you want to call me, right? And even though initially he wouldn't want to associate himself with that name, but because of the need to also redeem his identity, so accepting that identity or the recreated image through the process of rearticulation meant that he was open to he was taking that line that many other African American players took, which is the redemptive, the redemptive narrative, if that is correct. So I would just want to make my conclusion. So far, I've personally, one before I started going through the material, I really wanted to. One question that kept coming to my mind is, what exactly am I going to be able to take out of this whole, course material and all of that? How do I apply this? How does this really make sense to me, even as I do my work, or maybe as a social inclusion advocate, or perhaps wherever it is that we all are going to be positioned now, later, or in the future? And something kept coming to my mind, which is the fact that it is always easier than we possibly think to sell ideas or ideologies to people. Oftentimes, once you have power, you have control, and there is the need for the oppressed to negotiate, to consciously or unconsciously, or constantly rather, negotiate their presence in a space or at a given time. It makes it even very easy for ideologies to be propagated. And articulation then becomes the tool, using language through which we get to do this. So one thing that I made a couple of comments here, which are ideologies are wielded to assert or maintain control. Ideologies, through the process of articulation, are wielded to save face or to recreate images or identities. Ideologies are used to create movements. Ideologies can also serve as a tool for economic negotiation. And in closing, one thing that I also like to say is that when we think about brands in public relations, think about how there's there is need to recreate or re-articulate the image of an individual who is associated with a brand, and perhaps if for instance that individual, so let's say the message is to, now let me give an example that is even much more straightforward. When I think about Logani article and how the image of the, what's the name of that, the gay,
the cereal box one.
yeah, the cereal box, and so somehow the media or branding became the process through which the image of this very person who, despite that he was HIV positive and the fact that he's being gay, was considered negative. Using public relations or branding, this image was recreated. And so this is something that even we do in advertising, we do in brand promotion. This is something that can also be done even in the social advocacy work. So, for instance, I remember going to the Global Leadership Summit, and there was this lady who shared her story about how she was involved in, I mean, she was a victim of human trafficking and all of that. And one thing that I think stands out for me when I think about that incident and how it connects with my point on articulation is the fact that she created a new image for victims of human trafficking by starting an organization. And so the organization then became a tool through which she was able to carry on a new ideology to challenge the existing narrative against such people and to recreate a different identity. And so she being a successful victim of human trafficking or perhaps prostitute gave somehow, became um, something that was going to help to sell the message or to sell a story and say, you know what, if this person can become this, I think her name is Rebecca. It's also listed on the Global Leadership website. If Rebecca can become this person, you can also become this person, despite your constraint, despite your limitations. I think storytelling is at the center of articulation. So this is something we all need to think about. And for me, as I think about the future of my work in the nonprofit space, I think about how I can use stories. I am beginning to think about how it is possible to sell ideologies to people without even forcing them. It is possible to promote left-handedness without forcing people and say, you know what, everyone should be left-handed, right? It is possible to, and I think about that. I think about some of the things that I wrote in this book, which, began to make it easy for people to unconsciously accept the fact that, oh, left-handedness is cool after all, right? So this is somehow in this book, as I think about articulation, I made a conscious effort, even though I'm just realizing what I did, to re-articulate the image of left-handed people or left-handedness, especially because this group, among many other groups, is constantly stigmatized. And, thinking about that and how on our social media platform we begin to use stories of Barack Obama, very influential people around the world. So we're linking left-handedness. So this is the idea of linking elements. So we're beginning to link left-handedness with prestige, with class, with access, with being smart and all the good things that you can possibly think about. And this, of course, is a tool that I have used even before I realized it. And so I think this is, I must say that this has been an interesting, a journey for me myself, and I hope that we have been able to pick a thing or two. Thank you.